of Allah, praise be to our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to you all. May God bless you. A very good morning to you at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. We are joined today with a constellation of researchers. I would like to welcome Mr. Taher, Kanaan, Abdullah, Baabood, and the Ambassador Omar, al-Hassan. Will be tackling today the issues of economics in the GCC countries, and hopefully we'll plumb the depth of this session. Now we'll move to Ambassador Omar al-Hassan. Mr. Omar Hassan is the head of the Gulf Research Center at the College of Humanities and Sciences in Qatar, and he worked as the chief of the Gulf Research Center at the Cambridge University. Please, the floor is yours, sir. I am the head of the Gulf Center. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Here we are talking about the membership of the Gulf Center, which was held in Riyadh in May 2011. The issue was to do with accepting Jordan as a member of the GCC countries and the call on Morocco to accede to the Council. And it followed the awareness of the leadership vis-à-vis the grave challenges that they are facing, and believing that the old mechanisms that were depending on to secure the GCC countries has become perhaps ineffective, and consequently Jordan was invited to accede to the GCC countries as well as Morocco, and then financial support was afoot for Egypt, so that Egypt can become a central plank in the GCC countries' cooperation with the Arab world. These two steps allude to the fact that the GCC countries might expand indeed in order to enhance the Arab cooperation, whereby a number of issues can be considered. This study will look through such virtual expansion. I will be talking about the challenges, and I'll touch upon them briefly because there are plenty of papers that touch upon the socio-economic challenges, and we'll be talking about the feasibility of the expansion. And the third component will talk about future scenarios. The challenges, as you know, are old and new. Some of them were before the GCC establishment, and there were ramifications of such challenges in accordance with what took place in the world. There are also challenges after the establishment of the GCC bloc, and this had propelled the leaders to review the GCC bloc. And that's why we can talk about three challenges: security-related, economic, and social-related challenges. In brief, we would like to talk about the pre-establishment challenges, like the withdrawal of Britain and having in place 4 states in the Gulf countries, save Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. and the war of 1973 and the usage of the oil embargo in the Gulf, whereby the Gulf bloc has become a frontline bloc. There is also in 1979 the freeze of the membership of Egypt in the Arab League because of Camp David, as well as the Soviet-Afghan war, the Iranian-Iraqi war, and all these events propelled the establishment of the GCC bloc so that they can cooperate with each other rather than being small-sized countries. There are also other challenges, as you know, terrorism, Iran's ambitions, and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We can divide the challenges in accordance with the timing. The Iran-Iraq war, it was launched in 1980, 8 months before the GCC bloc was established, and the GCC Council was afraid of the spillover of such war, and that's why they supported Iraq. But at the same time, they didn't want for the war to spill over to their countries, and they indeed attempted through their relationship with the international community to internationalize the Iraqi-Iranian war. And in 1986 or 87, they resorted to indeed press the United Nations to pass the resolution number 578. There are also the Gulf War, whereby Iraq has invaded Kuwait, and it was a serious blow that was leveled against the joint Arab action. We have seen indeed calls to from the Gulf to get away from the Arab joint action, and as you know, the war of Kuwait's liberation has pushed the GCC countries to depend on the security aspect, and that's why the GCC countries have bought arms and they ratified agreements with the West. The United States of America has ratified security and defense agreements with the Gulf states, and during the 90s, this pressed ahead because of what used to be called the dual containment policy. But the link between the USA and the GCC countries has its own faults, because the extremist groups surfaced, and these agreements, security agreements, thought or propelled the issue of extremism. There's also the dissolution of the USSR and the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. The Afghan Arab jihadis went back to their countries and they posed a threat. There is also, as you know, the sanctions that were leveled against Iraq. It started in the 1990s up until the 2003, and this had cast its shadows. There is also the problem of the debt between Kuwait and Iraq. Since the start of the millennium, since the occupation of Iraq, the problem surfaced, and we have witnessed sectarianism. The new Iraq represents now a source of threat because the picture is blurry, and in terms of destroying Iraq economically, socially, and militarily, has led to the emphasis of Iran's power, and this has led to the arms race and destabilizing the issue. Clerics, religious clerics, surfaced as well, and they stoke the flames of sectarianism as well. Iraq has become a hotbed for attracting extremism. There is also the Israeli threat. Israel, as a matter of fact, is crisscrossing the world, especially in the north of Iraq. They are arming or training the Kurds, and they have plenty of activities inside Iraq through the security companies, the private ones, and thus we have seen sectarianism emphasized. There's also the Iranian issue. There's the Iranian nuclear dossier, and there's also extremism because the GCC countries, 19 people who were named as the perpetrators of the 11th of September, most of them came from the Gulf, and that's why the Gulf countries were pressurized, and indeed extremism was posing a great threat. When it comes to Israel, Israel doesn't pose a threat to Jordan or Syria or Lebanon or Palestine. It is a threat to every single Arab country, and that's why the GCC countries are not dissociated away from such a threat. So the GCC countries, they have an economic prowess and they can help the brotherly nations. There is also further challenges that relate to the withdrawal, perhaps the partial withdrawal of the USA from the Gulf countries. And as you know, they went eastwards and they went to the Asia Pacific. And the Arab Spring was also dangerous because the youngsters played a major role in the Arab Spring, and they resemble the lion's share of the population. This wave has toppled some regimes that looked stable because of the security apparatus that they led in Tunisia and Egypt, but we have witnessed a transitional period that was protracted, and the central government lost its sway. This took place in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, and as you know, the joint action led to handing over Libya to the NATO, and it was a crime. The Arab League has committed a crime because it didn't defend Libya, but it handed it over to the NATO. Well, and this took place in Syria as well. In Syria, the Arab League dissociated itself away from what took place, and Syria now is a hotbed of the international meddling. If we want to go back to the pre-Syrian crisis, we need billions of dollars, and as a matter of fact, we are, as Arabs, we committed grave mistakes in this regard. Before the Arab Spring, we had witnessed a project to disintegrate the Arab world. Somalia has been disintegrated, Sudan as well, and Syria, as you know, is subject to the sway of the militias. Also, we have witnessed organized crime, we have witnessed human trafficking, we have witnessed international meddling in our affairs. When it comes to the economic challenges, I'll touch upon them briefly. Most of the challenges relate to the change of the environment, the economic environment, the dependency on the migrant workers, and the lack of the capacity, the accommodation capacity of investment, and there is also the food security threat. As a matter of fact, here we would like to talk about the feasibility of the expansion of the GCC. The charter of the GCC has made it closed. The charter of the GCC has made this block a closed-up kind of block, but this didn't prevent the leaders from accepting the membership of Jordan and the invitation of Morocco to accede to the membership. And this is emblematic of laying off traditional kind of way of thinking and perhaps adopting regionality in order to perhaps amend the charter. So the expansion of the membership is a step in the door whereby things are changing. As you know, the EU has started from 6 countries, and now we are witnessing 28 countries. Indeed, the EU has developed what it called the association agreements, and they are paving the way for further accession of further members. The GCC, for example, has granted Yemen some of the membership of its institutions. The ASEAN was 6 and now it's 10. And in order for this bloc to be a member of the United Nations, the GCC ought to rehabilitate the new members in order to tackle the issues of security and so on and so forth. And this took place in Western Germany when it reunified the Eastern Bloc, and Korea as well faced the same issue when it thought of the reunification. The EU as well has made the same steps when the Eastern Bloc acceded to the membership of the EU. So this is this is a very important point to understand when it comes to the expansion of the GCC. When you have a full membership, it has to come gradually. There's also the option of the strategic partnership agreements, the integration as well agreements. When we talked about this for Jordan and Yemen and Morocco, and as well as the relationship between the GCC countries and Yemen, Egypt and Morocco. As a matter of fact, this feasibility study ought to take these steps into consideration in order to understand its nature. I would like to talk about the security feasibility. Please allow me 5 more minutes to finish my paper. The military cooperation started between the GCC through the Al Jazeera Shield in 1989, and it has been emphasized in the air, on land, and in the sea. And in the 2000, the leaders had an agreement of joint security, defense, and this security cooperation was afoot because the leaders emphasized their security through the bilateral agreements as well as buying arms and depending on the regional balance. However, there were imbalances indeed and some shortcomings. This balance was destabilized, and that's why the Gulf countries has depended greatly on the USA, and they stretched the security affiliation in the Istanbul conference with the America. The GCC has gradually lost the confidence in this umbrella because the Western protection was conditioned vis-a-vis applying certain reforms in accordance with the Western paradigm. America has invaded Iraq, as we know, in 2003, illegitimate manner, and they marginalized the Sunnis, and they emphasized the role of the Shia, and they turn a blind eye on the GCC countries when it comes to the nuclear Iranian dossier, the P5+1, and that's why the GCC countries have been gradually losing confidence in this protection umbrella, and that's why the GCC countries is expanding and is thinking of expanding and reaching out for other Arab countries, Yemen, Egypt, Jordan and Morocco. If they accede, then the structural problem will be resolved. As you know, the issues that relate to demography, security, and the migrant workers, and so on and so forth. These 4 countries, they resemble the manpower that is necessary not only to strike a balance in this country, but perhaps to be supreme in the full sense of the word. There's also the regional vacuum. As you know, the USA is withdrawing gradually from this area, so Iran will fill this gap, or perhaps Turkey, and these 2 countries are not acceptable in this area. The Arab countries ought to understand the feasibility of politics. They need to fill this gap in order to stave off the hegemony of other powers over the Arab countries. In order to be brief, I would like to say the following. This will resemble a propeller for the direction of the Arab joint action. We need indeed this propeller so that we can have the capacity to become successful and to surmount all the challenges, the regional and the international ones, and to emphasize the integration between the oil countries and the non-oil countries, and this will emphasize our self-satisfaction, and then we can arrange our house internally rather than being bombarded as the scenario of the Libya and Syria. In accordance with the IMF, $1.5 trillion for 55% of the GDP of the Arabs, $2.7 trillion, and 255 billion, 99 billion from Morocco, Jordan 31 billion. The GDP, the total one for this power will amount to 1.9 trillion dollars of the total GDP of the Arab world. If we talk about the future, the expansion of the GCC is a strategic challenge, and perhaps the lack of consensus might lead to the following scenarios. The first scenario is a full membership. The second scenario is full membership for some and partial membership for others. The third scenario is to emphasize this relationship with such countries to become strategic, integrated relationship. The first scenario, there are some disparities between the political regimes and the disparities between the socio-economic nuances, and some of them might provoke indeed the USA, Israel, and Iran. And as you know the reasons, and there are also other reasons whereby the GCC can lay off its own peculiarity or idiosyncrasy, because it will have different countries that are different from its regime and different socially, economically. Just give me 3 minutes, please. No, just 1 minute. Indeed, and this will burden the GCC because there will be indeed troubles internally. When it comes to the expansion, this might lead to avoiding some of the members. The second scenario might lead to having Jordan and Morocco, and it will be maintaining the coherence of the current regimes. The third scenario, whereby the relationship can become strategic, this scenario conforms with the charter of the GCC, which was closed off, consists of only 6 countries. If it expands, then this will turn strategic, and this will emphasize the unity of the GCC countries, and it will fill the gaps indeed. At the same time, it will allow the development of the relationship of the would-be members, and it will emphasize the room for development indeed in this bloc. Iran will oppose this scenario indeed, and it will reject the accession of Jordan and Morocco, and some other blocs might think that the Riyadh-Cairo action will emphasize the mechanism that we might depend on in order to reach regional stability, because this mechanism might be acceptable in the Arab world, especially when Yemen accedes to such bloc, because this is the moderation axis that was there before the Arab Spring. And thank you very much indeed, and sorry for taking much of your time.
I would like to thank His Excellency Ambassador Omar al-Hassan, and he heads the Gulf Research Center. He was ambassador of Arab League in London and Dublin, and acted as an advisor to the Maritime Academy. I thank him, and my apologies for interrupting him. With us we have Dr. Abdullah Baabood. He is the head of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University. He used to head the Gulf Studies Center at Cambridge University. May the blessings of God be upon you all. Good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to tell you, first of all, that some intensive negotiations have taken place between me and the chair of this session to regain some of my time after Dr. Omar al-Hassan has taken some of my time. but all my initiatives have ended in failure. So this means that I can have one option, and that is to get straight into the point and get on with it and make the best of time. When we talk about the GCC, what do we mean by that? The Gulf Cooperation Council, after all, is a regional organization, and many regional organizations which have been established around the world, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of the last century, when the different countries started adopting an approach of integration to intensify and maximize the economic benefits, and also for security and other reasons. For example, after the British withdrawal from the Gulf and the security vacuum and the Iranian threat, as was perceived at the time, the Iran-Iraq war, and the Russian bear coming closer to this area after the occupation of Afghanistan, then the collapse of the Arab order as a result of the peace accords, and of course the Iran-Iraq war. In addition to these threats, there were examples of cooperation between Gulf countries. One of these examples was the establishment of the United Arab Emirates as a federal state, established to achieve the interests and fulfill the interests of the member countries. For this experience to succeed, as it has done in the eyes of many, encouraged the approach to establish the Gulf Cooperation Council. Of course, before the establishment of this council, there was some sort of cooperation. Our citizens used to travel smoothly and freely between the different Gulf countries. There is also economic cooperation, and some economic, financial, and commercial organizations were in existence before the GCC. So the question now we can ask, has the GCC added any value, or was its establishment the only natural outcome of the geographic proximity and the historic relationships between its member states and the social ties between peoples and leaders of the GCC countries? This is a question we must pose every now and then to assess whether this council has achieved the ambitions behind its establishment. You know, it was established in 1981. The objectives and the aims are known to everybody. The preamble of the charter spoke of the possibility of unity or unification ultimately. And we said already that it was established for political reasons, and many similar organizations were established for the same reason. But the economic cooperation was easier to achieve than political cooperation, because economic cooperation bears fruit quicker than political cooperation. Economic cooperation is easier to achieve than political cooperation. Therefore, since the 1980s, the GCC countries embarked on their journey of economic cooperation and integration. So, from a common market established in 1983 to customs unity or unification of customs procedures, to a common market in 2008, to to agreement on a single currency in 2010. Now there is a suggestion or an idea to turn this cooperation into economic unity or unification, and ultimately a political one. If we view the different experiences of political integration so far as regional organizations are concerned, there are lessons to be learned. The Gulf countries, on their path to unification and integration, are not unique, and they're not an exception. There have been many countries who attempted similar steps in order to achieve peace and security for them and the world at large. And one of the main reasons behind establishing such organizations is to rid themselves of wars and conflict, like European countries after the experiences of the First and Second World Wars and other conflicts started to have groups like the groups of countries producing coal and steel, and ultimately they reached what we know today as the European Union. In fact, they managed to turn their relationships from one based on conflict and struggle to one based on prosperity, and so much so that the European Union is a major source of stability and peace in the world. And we learn from the literature that there are stages and phases to ultimately reach the desired goal. And they start with a common market, a free market, the customs union, and they develop to a common market, to real citizenship between the countries which are members of this union, then single currency, then economic unity, then political unity. So far, none of the experiences in the world has managed to achieve the ultimate goal of political union, not even the European Union, and you know that they too are facing problems in this regard. So we in the Gulf should first of all learn from the experiences of others. Having said that, we must also remember that there is no one experience that we can apply to all. Each region has its own specific features. For example, by and large, we are monarchies, non-democratic, newly independent, and in the first stages of development, unlike Europe, which was far more developed and more established democratically. So therefore, we cannot bring recipes from other people's experiences and try to apply them here into our situation. But however, there are ways and means they have adopted we can learn from, and learn from the obstacles they have faced. At the same time, we must realize that any approach towards integration is not an easy path. The ASEAN have taken more than 10 years. They were just discussing the idea of the project of the ASEAN concept, let alone how they established it. So 10 years only discussing the ideas. We did not take that much time. There were some visits exchanged by some rulers visiting others, and we know there is element of trust, thank God, and we started the journey towards integration. Other countries have taken much longer time, but it's true that maybe their experiences have been more successful. But we must also remember that no journey towards integration is free of pitfalls and obstacles. Everybody has gone through that, even the European Union. But what they managed to do is to benefit from the opportunities. It's true that the Gulf countries have taken many steps and measures towards integration. I've mentioned a few of them at the economic level, political level, security level, the defense level, and the recent summit meetings have come up with many decisions like establishing a joint defense force with a joint command and a maritime academy, a police academy, etc. So there is a lot of cooperation even at the security level. Prior to that, we had the the Arabian Peninsula Shield or Dar al Jazeera in Arabic. Nonetheless, there have been many defects because, after all, neither the economic work has been accomplished and completed, nor the customs union, despite officially agreeing. But there are a lot of obstacles when it comes to activating these agreements. The Gulf countries until now have not managed to reach agreement on, on how to, for example, exact the customs and excise duties. What I'm trying to say is there are many obstacles at all levels, even at the economic levels, and maybe the Gulf countries will be better off trying to solve these problems before jumping into another phase or stage, and we're not sure whether it will be worthwhile or not. Gulf countries suffer from these obstacles, and their leaders need to think this over in their summit meetings and come up with the kind of decisions which will help them build and establish real organizations and institutions which will help them achieve that. And there are decisions and legislative measures which should be applied to all to enable the people of these countries to represent themselves. We really need some real reform. We need the civil society to play a role in our attempts towards integration. But just to jump hastily into half-baked ideas, like what Dr. Omar al-Hassan has suggested of the expansion, including other countries, and they discovered that it was not serious and they forgot about it, or the idea of the union, and we haven't even prepared the ground for that. These are illusions and attempts to to escape reality, because reality on the ground means that regional cooperation is no easy task, and we should focus on achieving the minimum of what we agree on. I think I'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On your behalf, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank His Excellency Abdullah Mahmoud. And as a matter of fact, he wanted
Abdullah Baabood. Baabood. Baabood مش عبد محمود.
he wanted to follow the Iranian method in gaining time, but he failed. Anyway, we move to the third speaker. He's the head of the board of directors for the Arab Center for Researches and Policy Studies. His Excellency has held a number of posts. He worked at the Planning Ministry and the Ministry of Palestinian Occupied Territories Affairs, and he has got a PhD from Cambridge. Please, the floor is yours. Brothers and sisters, today's theme we'll be talking about the monetary system, the international monetary system, and the relationship thereby with the GCC economies. The main point here is the imbalances vis-à-vis the IMF, which is presented in having the dollar as the reserve currency for most of the countries across the globe. This has made the developing countries, which are in dire need of the development, it made them debtors, in debt, obviously. And those exporters, like the GCC countries who export oil, and China, and the southeastern countries, they are having surpluses in their budgets, and thereby they are reserving them as in bonds in the US Treasury. So these it was possible for these projects to be invested in some projects whereby the global economy can be emphasized, and the rates of employing laborers can be also emphasized. The imbalance is to do with the following: the size of the budget deficit in the USA for the 3 previous years amounted to $4.3 trillion in 2010, 4.5 trillion in $4.7 trillion in 2012. The deficit of the current account for the 3 years in the USA amounts to $500 billion for every year, and these are supplied by the reserves of the most of the countries, especially those countries who's got surpluses, especially the GCC countries and China. The size of the surpluses of the current accounts for the energy exporting countries, except the United Arab Emirates, because it is not included in the statistics, in comparison with the Arab importing countries, energy in the 2 years. Those who export energy have 358 million in 2012. However, the deficit, on the other hand, amounts to $734 million. China has a surplus of $193 billion. This chart This graph shows the highest surpluses and those, on the other hand, who's got the highest deficit. We can see that the surplus countries, China is at the top of the list, and the deficit countries is the deficit countries. The USA is at the end of the list. So what did the GCC countries do to shake off the restrictions of the US dollar as the reserve currency after the crisis has hit in 1997? The world has talked about amending the monetary system. Japan, for example, has launched a project to have a monetary Asian bank with the capital of $100 billion in order to recover in 1997. However, the IMF, or this initiative, has failed because the IMF, with the pressure of the USA, has succeeded to make it a failure. Afterwards, some other initiatives, the initiative of Chiang Mai, took place in order to adapt the international monetary system away from the interest of the United States and for the interest of the emerging countries and the developing countries. After the Chiang Mai initiative, the BRICS has surprised the world because it emphasized its efforts to emphasize the status, the economic status of the BRICS countries. China, Russia, as you know, India, Brazil, and South Africa. The 5 countries indeed has agreed upon having a central bank, and it took place on the 15th of July in Brasilia of 2014. And the bank agreement reflects the fact that these countries are convicted of the importance of having credit-based institutions in order to provide credit for the corporates in such countries. And this importance has emanated from the difficulties that the developing countries has faced in accessing the credit in order to bridge the gaps in the needs, especially when it comes to sustainable development. And that's why the paragraphs or the provisions of the agreement vis-à-vis the objectives of the bank, it stipulates the fact that the bank will mobilize the resources in order to support the infrastructure projects and other projects related to the sustainable development as a complementary effort with the multinational funding institutions as well as the regional institutions in order for the international growth to grow further. The accession of such a bank is open for the members of the United Nations, whether it was a country in need of money or otherwise. The capital of this new development bank is $50 billion that have been there already, and another 50 that will follow suit. The voting system is in conformity with the money each country pays, and the estimation credit capacity amounts to the tune of $34 billion annually. In parallel to what took place in Brasilia, the China has founded the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank on the 24th of October 2014. And this was an attempt to challenge the other credit providing institutions where the USA has the hegemony over. China has declared the intention of creating such a bank in 2013, and it invited a number of countries to participate in such bank. And the invitation didn't confine itself to Indonesia, South Korea, and Australia, but it covered a number of European countries as well. But the United States of America has exerted pressures on the invitees whereby these countries did not accede to such initiative. India was the only country who wanted to accede, and it did, obviously, in 2014. And it is envisaged that 9 countries from the ASEAN will accede to such a bank, except Indonesia. And from the Arab countries, Oman, Kuwait, and Qatar will also be members. Some Asian countries like Australia and Korea have not participated in this effort. The purpose of the purpose of the establishment of such bank, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, is to do with the erosion of the infrastructure in the Asian countries, and whereby it relates to the economic backwardness in such countries, and it reins in its growth towards the future. In addition to such initiatives, or in contrast with such initiatives, the Chinese initiatives and the BRICS initiatives, the disaster lies in the following. In our Arab countries, we have not had any initiative, any similar initiatives as such, and we have turned a blind eye to making this bloc a superpower, because the interests that we gain in the Arab world do supersede the Chinese ones and the Southeast ones if it has been mobilized in order to reform the imbalances of the monetary system. As a matter of fact, we can plumb the depth of this matter extensively, but hopefully I wished that I had illustrated in such comparisons that there are indeed huge opportunities in the Arab world, but we turn a blind eye to them because of the disintegration and perhaps and the lack of insight and the lack of hindsight in our policies that relate to the International Monetary Fund. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taher Kanaan, for respecting the time limit. And now we open the floor for questions and answers. Please, no more than 2 minutes for each intervention. I would like to engage in a discussion with panelists. In my opinion, the lack of democracy represents the main obstacle on the path of integration. Democracy can support that and not hinder it. For example, we have the referendum in Scotland of 2014 and the referendum in Holland before that, and on both occasions, the people did not want to leave the union they were part of. We know there are divisions. Some of the competition really, if we take the Egyptian Saudi ones, and the conflicts in the past have been present in the history of the relations, and some people are saying that no more anymore we can rely on the Saudi-Egyptian joint efforts or joint products. Some say that raising the standard of democracy, education is the best path, and in any event, the Gulf countries should try and solve their own problems. For example, we remember Al-Arabi magazine, which has been around for 40, 50 years, and others. I call for closer cultural ties between the GCC countries. Thank you, Dr. Tawfiq. When we talk about the GCC as a regional organization, and we talk about joint initiatives within this regime or system, it's different than talking about the bilateral relations when two countries engage in a dialogue over some joint and common bilateral interests. But when a group of countries get together, they will not be talking about common interests and bilateral relations, but different things. And I have a different opinion than Dr. Baabood. There are many agreements, yes, and he talked about many agreements, but most of them have not been implemented, or sometimes implemented in a very distorted way. The relations really are still on bilateral basis. We do not have policies or steps we take as a group, as an organization, since the establishment of the GCC until now. Dr. Ali. Please introduce yourselves before asking or commenting. Ali Fakhro from Bahrain. Sir, I think all this talk which has been going on, we must take it back to the basics. We must ask, is there really serious intent for the GCC to move towards the aim which was behind its establishment, to be a union of nations or countries? I don't think they are serious. And why I say that is because the prime ministers of the member countries never meet. They have nothing to do with the work of the group. Only heads of state and sometimes foreign ministers and other ministers. If the prime ministers were asked right from the start to be in charge of implementing joint policies and decisions because a prime minister has a role on supervisor or executive role over all the ministries. Secondly, after all these years, we do not have portfolios, ministers charged with the inter-council relations. We should have a minister designated to the task of coordination and should be based in Riyadh. Dr. Abdullah talked about differences and maybe Dr. Omar before him. These differences, shouldn't we look for an arbiter, someone to be like to arbitrate in case of disputes to settle these disputes? Fourthly, the question of national sovereignty is such a big thing now, and the Arab Spring has proven to us that these countries do not understand that without joint sovereignty, there is no point in having councils like this. And if we remind ourselves not of the European Union's experience, but the Malaysian one, Malaysia has an Eastern culture. Different sultans decided to have a union. They share power quietly. These are very important, pivotal issues because we diagnose problems but forget that what matters is inside the council, the GCC. I have a feeling that nobody wants to do anything about that and the lack of political will to solve these problems. Dr. Aid, thank you. Thank you, sir. I just wanted to say that it should be clear that I'm not against expansion, but I have a question to Dr. Omar al-Hassan. He talked about the legal aspects of expansion. I think there is an important issue here which we tend to forget, and that is the peoples of the GCC countries. We are not asked, the people were not asked when the council was established and it became a political reality for us. Now we have something else that we started hearing that other countries will will be joining the GCC Council. Maybe they will join us, then we have a problem with them, then we have a problem with their people, and we are absent. I don't know why our government seems to think that they have the right to do these things without consulting our people. And I wish one of the panelists should talk about the legal right of the peoples of the GCC countries to say yes or no. We don't want this thing to turn into a joke in the future. At least to keep it between us, and if we want to expand or anything of the sort, should give our people the right to have a say in this. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad al-Misfir. Thank you, Chair. I completely agree with what Dr. Fakhru and Mr. Tawfiq Saif have said, but I have some comments to make on what Abdullah Baabood said. He says that the European Union has taken has taken 50 years to be established. They have thousands of languages and cultures, and so maybe they have to do that. But it's a different story for us. We have one language, one religion, basically originally one tribe from which we all have descended. So we do not need 50 years and 40 years to experiment. The experiments in Europe are different. The Asian examples are closer to us. The sultans in Malaysia are similar to the sultans we have here. And also, why should we always take other people's experiences as a yardstick to measure our own experience? Of course, we must look around and benefit from the experiences of others, but ultimately it should be our own experimentation. I say the General Secretariat of the GCC Council, unfortunately, is nothing more than a group of bureaucrats, slightly different, slightly different than the Arab League. The Arab League only employs retired, rejected staff, and the GCC employs fresher ones and younger ones. But ultimately, it's the same bureaucracy. They have no strategic thinking. The GCC has 15 assistant general secretaries. The UN has assistant secretary generals, but it's a different organization altogether. The number of staff we have is even more than the Arab League. So if the GCC, if it wants to develop, they should start with their general secretariat. They should have an elected members, and then they together form an advisory council of independent experts from different countries to act as an advisory council, and also should their opinion should be binding and should be on legal, political, and scientific methodologies. Also, if we want to expand, then we say that we should look closer at home, and we cannot have a real GCC council without Iraq or Yemen, but not the Iraq of today and the Yemen of today. And we know Jordan is an important country too, for one reason, because Jordan now is the subject of heated competition from Israel on one side, Iran on the other. So therefore, I think we better benefit from Jordan and not leave it to the others. Thank you, Mr. Ahmed Azm. Ahmed Azm. Thank you. I'll start with an observation regarding what Dr. Taher Kanaan has said, and then link it to what Dr. Omar al-Hassan said. You said that Flex has a bank now, and we have an investment bank in Asian infrastructure, and Europe, when they tried to solve the financial crisis, they attempted some self-financing. So it seems that now the idea of regional banks now as shouldn't we think of something similar to the IMF and the World Bank, and we leave it to deal with countries with no regional framework. And now I turn to Dr. Omar al-Hassan's paper. and the point of partnership between the GCC countries. I think the projects of expansion and to add Jordan and Morocco reflects concern and anxiety amongst the member states. Shouldn't they focus more on solving the problem that international monetary organizations and funds should be replaced with some sort of regional integration? I'm not saying a union as such, because there are many political objections. Why don't they have some sort of a partnership similarly to the European Mediterranean Partnership, and also to prepare these countries not to join, add them to the membership of the organization, but to keep them safe from problems. So therefore, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank now are on the retreat in favor of regional solutions. Why don't we try something similar? Dr. Sarhan Al-Ataibi. In the name of God, Dr. Sarhan Al-Ataibi from the King Saud University, Riyadh, Political Sciences Department. I may agree or disagree with the panelists, but I think we are blowing out of proportion the importance and the size of the GCC, and I think we are being unfair to the European Union or the Malaysian Federation when we compare them to the GCC or compare the GCC to them. If we take into consideration the cultural, political, media, and other aspects, we're talking about entities who cannot be consistent in their policies or positions that they take. The GCC countries have no clear policy, no clear program, that it deals with other countries according to. They have no clear political program or economic program. You see, once there is a problem between two countries, we see that the peoples immediately end up suffering, and we see social networks engaging in all sorts of mudslinging between them. So how can we still say we are one family and one people with one culture, etc., etc.? And I think this, if we continue like this, we'll be wasting our breath and our energy. Foreign policy is a productive policy, but if the foreign policy is not clear, it will be some sort of consumerism, not productive. Productive policies do not accept others to dictate terms to them, but the kind of weak policy, which is the kind of policy we have, unfortunately ends up accepting anything thrown at it. That's why we will be in a state of conflict, and we will continue. So,
Mr. Salman, Dardi, is it? Mr. Salman. Salam alaikum. Yeah, Mr. Suleiman Zwari Farhat from the Mila University in Algeria. Mr. Abdullah has talked about the incrementality in the integration of the GCC. My question is, do you think that rushing things up and following the steps of expediency might have a negative impact? And you have talked about perhaps the customs union, and you have talked about the monetary union. Don't you think that the monetary union is a long-term objective for the GCC? And there's also another point. Don't you think that when we want to integrate or to have a joint currency, we need to have pillars to depend on, like having a stability in the monetary system of the Gulf countries? We see that the Kuwaiti dinar was pegged to the dollar in order to get to the joint currency, but then it did not continue. Do we think that we have as well some problems when it comes to the inflation in the GCC countries? All these components have been dealt with, have been considered. So my question is, the bottom line is the expediency process. Don't you think that we are rushing things up? I would like also to pose a question to Mr. Taher. He said that the interest and the surpluses have been invested in the American bonds. And he talked about the huge inflation of the interest in comparison with the real economy. What kind of mechanism that we can follow in order to invest such interest? Do you think that these surpluses can be invested in the sovereign funds?
الدكتور أحمد المسفاري.
Dr. Ahmed al-Misfari.
ربما يكون هذا آخر سؤال.
Perhaps this will be the last question.
دكتور أحمد.
أيوه.
Dr. Ahmed.
هو في البداية أنا بتفق.
At the outset, I do agree with the vision of Dr. Abdullah Baabood in terms of not expanding the GCC currently unless we emphasize certain components. My question is to Mr. Omar al-Hassan. What is the political and economical outcome of Jordan and Morocco acceding to the GCC? And as you know, Jordan is close by, but Morocco is too far from us. When it comes to Jordan, there are disparities in the system. There are disparities indeed in the economic nuances between the two countries as well. What's your comment on that?
تفضل. تفضل أهلا. تفضل سيد.
شكرا.
Thank you.
محمود مراد من لبنان.
Mahmoud Murad from Lebanon.
أنا لن أطول في مداخلتي.
I will be brief. Actually, I have raised my hand. The first one I raised my hand in this hall. The chairman is saying that's why I'll give you another minute. The Arabs have been disintegrated after the Sykes-Picot Accord into entities. The best case scenario, I can say that these entities were at peace with each other, but sometimes we have witnessed fighting. But then the Arab League was established, and the objective of the Arab League was to do with disintegrating the Arabs rather than uniting them. What's taken place in Syria and Iraq is as follows. The Abbasids' capital has been destroyed, and the Umayyads' capital has been destroyed. The gentleman means Damascus and Baghdad. So everyone is racing to get to heaven, and this heaven, the athletes or those who are racing, come through burning the Arabs first. They want a heaven that burns the Arabs first. Don't you think that this is an incentive for our beloved people in the Gulf. Do you think that this should be an impetus in order to understand the identity of the Arabs and emphasize and polish the Arab identity in the GCC? We cannot expand. If you got a car and there is a wheel that is dent or puncture in the wheel, then you have to stop on the sideline, the hard shoulder. You can't move further. The Gulf ought to be emphasized, and we have plenty of studies that allude to the fact that the Gulf bloc is very important and is the first player in the movement of the international capital. With its wealth and culture, it suffices to say that Mecca is from the Gulf and Muhammad the Prophet is from the Gulf. This what was left in the Arab system. We are looking for you. Every single Arab hopes that you would follow the reform. I am not a Lebanese. I am an Arab. I belong to the Arab. I am Omani, Qatari, Bahraini, Iraqi, Saudi, and that's why they used to say in the past, I'll be brief, they used to say that the 1,000 miles journey begins with one step. We can say if we retreat from the 1,000 miles journey, it will also start with one step. I will end by saying that those who do not know their objective, they will lose indeed the steps that might be taken to get to the objective. Thank you very much, Mr. Muhammad Al-Afandi. You've got 2 minutes. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a comment on Mr. Taher's paper vis-a-vis the usage of the surpluses, the interests. When we look at the usage of the surpluses, we need to understand that the optimum use of such surplus depends on a number of issues. First, the economic determinants, and then the political determinants, and then the social ones. And here we can see that we have 2 scenarios. Perhaps we might compete in using such surplus, or we can follow the Chinese and the Asian method, because they in Southeast Asia and Japan and China, they compete in using their surplus when it comes to the dollar. When it comes to our reality in the Arab world, we can see that here we look at the economic dimension per se. We have surpluses, but the political and the social determinant do not conform to the economic ones. And that's why I can see that the political will is weak in investing such surpluses. But when we customize and adapt such surpluses, we can see that they might be framed in what we call the integrated model. So such institutions, such Arab institutions can complement the international institutions rather than competing with them in the first stage. And that's why you can see there is the Arab Monetary Fund, and there is the Development Bank in Jeddah, and institutions. And these institutions need developing, and they need support, and they need to have buffers or capitals in excess in order to serve these countries and the Arab and the Islamic world. And that's why I do think that we are still in the first steps of such model. I mean the complementary rather than the competitive one. So to what extent this description might reflect the reality, or are we still in the first step of this method? Thank you for everyone, and it is obvious from the comments that the GCC has been looked up for And there are aspirations for this, aspirations for the GCC that have been reflected in the Arab world, and but the GCC indeed was able to obtain some achievements, but there are some polarizations, some challenges, but the hopes are great, as our
المجلس ولكن بودي
Oscar
أن
has
دائما
said.
الخطة
He
كاملة. لا يمكن لهذه الأمة
asked the GCC countries to play a major role in this regard, but I wish he spoke to all the Arab countries, because all the Arab countries ought to have a say. All the intellectuals, the rulers and the ruled ought to play a major role in the revival process of the Arab countries.
تريد أو تدعي أو
And
هي
as they say, it takes two to tango, and indeed, I think that we cannot reach the optimum without our Arab brothers and sisters, and that's why hopes are being pinned on everyone, and especially the elite, in order to become advisors in the universities, in the governments, in the institutions, so that they can help to reach welfare, prosperity, justice, human rights, and emphasis on the value of humans, and not only the talk about the economic or the socio-economic issues. I would like to move to the panelists. I'll start with Dr. Taher. I'll allocate 3 minutes for him to answer some of the questions or perhaps add something, please.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
هناك رسالة فيما
There is a message in what I attempted to talk about. I wanted to convey a message. There is an imbalance in the system, the international system of providing credits and funding, and this in itself burdens the developing countries, the Southeast Asian and Latin Americas, as well as the Arab countries, especially the GCC countries. I've explained and I said that there is a burden, there are shortcomings, and there are imbalances, and there are funds that follow certain decisions. The international institutions our brother has alluded to are successful indeed. The IMF and the World Bank, these are successful institutions, but the decision of investing certain funds in certain countries, decision has nothing to do with the developing countries. The decisions that are taken are in the hands of the superpowers. As you know, the BRICS and the developing countries, they objected to such voting system. They said that having the growth and reaching a certain amount of surplus was not reflected in the voting system of decision making in such institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. The other point of the message that I wanted to convey is that, as opposed to such imbalances, there are some countries that try to bridge the gap, but in the Arab world there is a total paralysis when it comes to bridging the gap and plugging the holes. There are two humble initiatives in the Arab world, and they are related to the establishment of the Arab Fund of Socio-Economic Development and also the Arab Monetary Fund. These are two institutions. When it comes to the annual credit of the Arab Monetary Fund from 2009 up until 2013 did not exceed half a billion.
سنة 2013
In 2013, it amounted to $689 million, American dollars. The Arab Fund in 2013 has provided credit to the tune of 1 billion. The new credit bank or development bank in China can indeed provide credit to the tune of $34 billion annually. There is an initiative that took place because of the Syrian crisis. The GCC countries met together and they wanted to do something vis-à-vis the Syrian refugees. As a matter of fact, the projects whereby agreements being agreed upon for the funding purposes, the Gulf grant to Jordan for only one country amounted to $2.8 billion, and the total grant amounted to $5 billion. So when push came to shove, as such, the Gulf countries moved very quickly and they appropriated $5 billion in order to help the Syrian refugees in Jordan. That's only one country. Okay, so when we look at such assistance and the development needs, on the other hand, that means we have the capacity to move further and to expand our initiatives. This is just an example. Thank you.
شكرا لمعالي الدكتور.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
سعادة السفير.
Your Excellency Ambassador, the floor is yours.
أسئلة كثيرة.
As a matter of fact, there are plenty of questions. Perhaps you would allow me more time when it comes to Dr. Amjad. Dr. Amjad talked about the axis. I haven't said that Saudi-Egyptian axis might resemble the way you understood it. We have an Arab catastrophe. Some powerful Arab countries can resemble a spearhead in this effort. The group ought to be able to reach a joint Arab action. We are in a very difficult position. We have handed over Libya. Iraq has gone. Lebanon is facing big troubles, and so on and so forth, because we do not have the power that propels the Arab joint action. So we thought that there is a hope. The GCC, Egypt, Yemen, Jordan, and Morocco, and those who want to follow suit as well. And that's why I didn't focus on the Egyptian-Saudi axis in the way that you have presented. Dr. Tawfiq, as a matter of fact, I think that the GCC has been born to continue. We need to preserve it, regardless of its shortcomings. We need to focus on the achievements and we need to flag it up. Dr. Ali asked a question. He said, does the GCC take things seriously? I think they take things seriously. They do not take things with a pinch of salt. I think over the 34 past years, the GCC countries played a major role, and it now has been talked about internationally, and it resembles a bloc that is powerful. Those advisors and intellectuals and pundits in the GCC countries can move forward regardless of the shortcomings. We need to provide for our leaders, and the GCC countries studies and researches whereby they can depend on to take their decisions so that to propel the achievements of the GCC and to modernize it. Because this hope, as Dr. Mahmoud has said, this is our only hope after the Arab system has disintegrated. This is the only hope that we can depend on, and it can attract the other Arab countries. I would like to appeal, I would like to talk personally here. My own perspective. We need to support our countries. We, as countries, cannot interfere in the other countries' internal affairs. We need to arrange our own house first and then perhaps reach out to the others. Uh, there is a saying that the doctor knows. It says, make your neighbor rich in order for you to be rich. So Bahrain is in need, Yemen is in need, and other countries are in need, and we can appropriate certain money to provide for such countries. Egypt nowadays is in dire need of financial assistance, and it can indeed emerge from under the surface of the rubble. I think that supporting such countries might achieve great things. We need to look back in the history and understand the successful stories. When it comes to democracy, we can take what suits us and we can customize it. We cannot take the democracy and just copy and paste it. Some intellectuals and politicians said, this is Britain, we need a constitutional monarchy. Britain has reached constitutional monarchy after 8 centuries of struggle, so we cannot just copy and paste it. Mr. Al-Masfar said, he talked about the Arab university. I worked in the Arab university, and I say that those who work in that universities are retirees.
ليك عرب ليك جامعة الدول العربية.
The Arab League, those who work in the Arab League are retirees. They are people who had certain posts somewhere and they knew somebody. Sometimes they followed favoritism. And those who work in the Arab League, they will be burdened with plenty of issues, and sometimes they reach a dead end. When it comes to the Maghreb countries, we had a conference at the University of Kuwait, and I was there, and the conference tackled the issue of the Maghreb relationship with the GCC. When we see the investments of the GCC in the Maghreb countries, they are in billions, indeed, in Mauritania, in Morocco, in Tunisia, and in Algeria. Dr. Sarhan has talked about the foreign policy, and he dissociated it from the economic policy. Indeed, I see that the foreign policies in the GCC countries are on a par with each other. Qatar might be peculiar sometimes. They have certain stances that are different from the other countries. But I think that the GCC foreign policy ought to be unified, regardless of the justifications of Qatar, regardless of Qatar being wrong or true, because the threat is the same and the challenges are the same, and Qatar, through its foreign policy and media policy with the GCC countries, I think it has to be reviewed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Your Excellency. Ambassador, now I'll pass the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Baabood. The floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your questions, and I apologize for not answering all of them because they were numerous, and sometimes I couldn't hear, to be honest with you, the questions. But I'll start by saying the following. What I was talking about is an intellectual research-based theme that relates to the political realism in the area. And I try to understand what took place in the GCC countries and in line with the developments in the region and internationally. Away from the good offices and the discourse and the narrations and so on and so forth, I talk about political realism. And the political realism says that there is extreme envy when it comes to this area, and this envy comes from the nature of the rentier economy of this bloc. We cannot underestimate this status or this realism. And the good offices are futile when it comes to politics or understanding politics. It is true that we have common issues in the Gulf, but we have differences. We cannot turn a blind we cannot turn a blind eye on the differences. We can believe in the commonalities, on the things that are common. This GCC has been established and it needs to continue. But as they say, the devil lies in the detail, in the small nuances, and there are differences indeed between these countries. Some countries emphasize sectarianism, sometimes believe in one school of thought. Some countries are more advanced than the other, and some countries are still backward indeed, or perhaps hasn't jumped yet on the bandwagon. So there are differences, and the nature of the people sometimes is different. This is our reality. This is our political, socio-economic reality. There are poor countries and rich countries, small-sized countries and big countries. So we cannot just follow our good intention and reach out to have union. Reforming the council is a necessity. I think that we have to look at the half full cup, or the cup half full rather than the cup half empty. And I think that there are shortcomings, there are failures, and this applies to every single bloc across the globe. But we need to learn from our failures and turn them into successes. When it comes to expansion, I think this is a rich countries club, a club for those countries whose political regime is similar. It is to do with royalties and monarchies. And leaders here, when we thought of expanding, they thought of Jordan and Morocco. Because Morocco is a monarchy and Jordan is a monarchy. The Moroccans actually didn't know the decision. I was at the embassy and the Moroccan embassy, and they used to say to us, "We are embarrassed now. How could we deal with such decision? If we refuse, then they will be embarrassed. They will be outraged." And if we do not accept, or if we accept, then we'll be perhaps mad. We do belong to the Maghreb bloc. How can we reach out to the GCC? In Jordan, I do support this idea, but I would like to ask you a question. The GCC, when it incorporates Jordan, will they agree on the Wadi Araba agreement, for example, between Jordan and Israel? And there are other implications that deals with the politics, the internal politics of Jordan. So we need to integrate amongst each other in the Gulf and perhaps reform the internal problems and the council. I would like to conclude briefly. We cannot look at the GCC countries as if they were a cash cow. We need to look at different matters. I do not think that they will appropriate a huge amount of money in the Arab world. We have learned from the history that the capital is coward. Sometimes they help some regimes that conform with their agenda. They might perhaps agree with the coup in Egypt and support it, but to what extent this will be judged by history. But we don't think that the GCC countries will appropriate certain money to the Arab countries, because this doesn't conform with the nature of the capital. What we need to do is for the Arab countries to revive and to be on the track of growth, and for the Arab League as well to play a major role in this. The Gulf countries are not the Arab League. They are the Panalogs of the EU. The Panalogs, as you know, they are Luxembourg, Netherlands, and Belgium. They are monarchies inside the EU. So the GCC countries might resemble this bloc. They are quasi-regional, and the Arab League ought to be the umbrella to work on this matter in order to deepen the relationship between the GCC countries, as well as reach out to the other Arab countries through the Arab League. But this needs a different mentality. We haven't reached there yet. Thank you.
أخيرا شكرا للمحاضرين الكرام.
Thank you, Dr. Taher Kanaan, Dr. Abdullah Baabood, Dr. Omar Hassan.
ولكم جزيل الشكر.
Thank you very much.
ولمركز الأبحاث الشكر.
And thank you to the Arab Center and the state of Qatar and the organizers. Thank you all for your efforts. And we come to the conclusion of this session.